Emily and her brother Tom had always dreamed of escaping the chaos of city life. The constant hum of traffic, the crowded streets, and the suffocating noise of a million voices had worn them down over the years. So, when they stumbled across a small, isolated house in a sleepy town miles away from the nearest city, they jumped at the opportunity. It seemed like the perfect escape, a chance for a fresh start. The house was nestled at the edge of a dense forest, far from any neighbors, offering a level of peace they had longed for. The house, though old, was charming in its own way. Its brick walls were weathered, and the roof had clearly seen better days, but there was something inviting about it, perhaps the way the ivy curled around the front porch or the creaky wooden steps that led up to the door. The real estate agent, an older man with thick glasses and an awkward, yet polite manner, had been unusually quiet about the house's past. He didn't mention its age, over 100 years old, or the strange fact that it had been vacant for nearly a decade. The price had been suspiciously low, and Emily, more than anyone, was willing to overlook these oddities. The house was within their budget, and it was exactly the kind of place they had always imagined living in. The first day was filled with excitement and anticipation. Tom was already talking about how he could turn the attic into his studio, and Emily was daydreaming about gardening in the backyard. They unloaded their belongings, each of them losing themselves in the thrill of a new beginning. The town was small, barely more than a handful of people lived there, and Emily had the sense that nothing much ever happened. The perfect place for quiet, rural living. But as the day drew to a close and the sun dipped below the horizon, a sense of unease began to settle over Emily. She couldn't quite explain it, but there was something about the house that felt wrong. It wasn't obvious, at least not at first. The walls were thick, and the air was musty with the scent of old wood and dust. The floorboards creaked underfoot as they moved about, but it wasn't the kind of creaking that came with age. It was a low groan, almost as if the house itself was stretching, waking up from a long slumber. That night, as they prepared for bed, Emily felt it most acutely. It was past midnight when she first heard it, a faint, unsettling noise. It was hard to pinpoint at first, like a rustling, soft and deliberate. At first, she thought it was the wind or maybe the house settling, but as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder. It sounded like whispers, low, indistinct words that didn't make sense. The kind of sound you hear just on the edge of sleep, when your mind plays tricks on you. She glanced at Tom, who was already asleep, his back turned toward her. The room felt colder than it had earlier, and Emily pulled the blankets tighter around her. She told herself it was nothing. Old houses made noises. It was the wind. It was nothing more than her imagination. But then the whispers stopped abruptly. A deep silence filled the room, almost suffocating in its weight. And that's when Emily felt it, a distinct, almost tangible sensation of being watched. Her heart began to race, and she felt a chill run down her spine. There was nothing to see, nothing she could point to, but the feeling was undeniable. It was as though something, or someone, was standing just beyond her sight, waiting, observing. The feeling lingered long after the noise faded, and as Emily finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, she couldn't shake the sense that they had made a mistake, that something about this house wasn't just old. It was alive. The following morning, Emily tried to brush off the eerie feelings from the night before. It was just the stress of moving, she told herself. There had been a lot to organize and unpack, and her mind had been working overtime. But as the day wore on, it became harder to ignore the unsettling sense that something wasn't right in the house. It wasn't anything she could directly point to, it wasn't like the house was actively trying to harm them. But there was an overwhelming presence, a feeling that the walls were more than just structures, they seemed to hold memories, or worse, something lingering from the past. As Emily and Tom moved from room to room, unpacking boxes, the noises began again. It started with small, almost imperceptible sounds, things shifting, subtle creaks, the faint scraping of wood on wood. At first, Emily thought it was just the house settling. Old houses, after all, did strange things. But the sounds were becoming more pronounced. She would hear them in one room, then, when she moved to another, the sounds would follow, always just behind her, always a beat too late to be explained away. The most troubling part, however, was the way the house seemed to change. In the mornings, the sunlight would flood through the windows, and the house would feel warm and inviting. But by late afternoon, when the light started to fade, the atmosphere would shift. The air would grow heavier, colder, and the shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. Emily would walk through the narrow hallways and find herself instinctively looking over her shoulder, as though something, or someone, was standing just out of sight. By the third night, Emily couldn't deny it anymore. She wasn't imagining things. Something was wrong with the house. That night, she woke suddenly, her body stiff with tension. The whispers were back. They were faint at first, like a soft wind through a crack in the window. But as she strained her ears to listen, they grew louder. The voices were closer now, coming from somewhere just outside the bedroom. Emily's heart raced as she held her breath, trying to identify the words. They were soft, hushed, and barely audible, but unmistakably human. They sounded like a conversation, but it was just out of reach, just beyond her comprehension. Emily turned to Tom, hoping to find comfort in his presence. But he was still fast asleep, oblivious to the noise that filled the room. She watched him for a moment, wondering if maybe it was just her imagination running wild. The house was old, after all, and the walls were thin. Perhaps it was the neighbors, or even the wind playing tricks on her. But as she lay there, unable to shake the growing sense of dread, the whispers stopped abruptly. The room became eerily quiet. Too quiet. And then, there was a sound that made her blood run cold, a faint scratching, coming from the far side of the room, just behind the door. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't anything natural. It was deliberate, slow, like someone, or something, was clawing at the wood, trying to get in. Emily sat up in bed, heart hammering in her chest, her eyes fixed on the door. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The scratching continued, and for a moment, all she could do was listen. It went on for several minutes, until finally, it stopped, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence. But the unease remained. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been making those sounds wasn't finished yet. It was waiting for something. She tried to convince herself it was just her nerves. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The house wasn't just old. It wasn't just settling. There was something else here, something that had been waiting, quietly, for years. And it was beginning to make its presence known. The dark secrets beneath. The next day, Emily's unease had only deepened. She couldn't shake the images from the photographs she had found in the basement. The faces with their eyes scratched out, especially the one that looked like hers. She kept telling herself it was just a coincidence, a trick of the mind, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Tom, oblivious to her growing anxiety, was busy in the attic, setting up his workspace. Emily, desperate to distract herself, decided to take another look in the basement. She had to make sense of what she'd found. Her mind kept racing back to the chest, its old wood and rusted lock. There was something about it that felt like it was meant to be discovered, like it had been waiting for her. The basement was still dark and musty. The air was cold, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. Emily descended slowly, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She approached the chest again, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands were shaking as she pried it open. Inside, the same yellowed photographs stared back at her, their blank, scratched-out faces unsettling in their silence. She sifted through them again, but this time, something caught her eye. Tucked beneath the photos was a small, folded piece of paper. Emily unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling. It was a note, written in a messy, hurried scrawl, "They're still here. Don't stay too long. Asterisk." Her blood ran cold. The message was vague, but it felt like a warning, one she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. She dropped the paper, suddenly feeling the weight of the basement's oppressive air pressing in on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving, waiting just out of sight. She backed away from the chest, her heart racing. Then, she heard it, a soft creaking sound from behind her, as though someone had stepped onto the wooden floor. She turned quickly, but the basement was empty. Her breath caught in her throat, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Before she could react, the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, coming closer. She didn't wait to find out who, or what, was making them. She turned and fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. The return of the lost. That night, Emily could hardly bring herself to sleep. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees made her heart race. She hadn't told Tom about what she'd found in the basement. She wasn't sure how to explain it, or if he would even believe her. He had always been the rational one, the one who dismissed her feelings as overreaction. But tonight, Emily could feel the house pressing in on her, suffocating her with its silence, its weight. Around midnight, she woke with a start. At first, she thought it was just the dreamlike fog of sleep, but then she heard it, soft whispers, just outside the door. They weren't clear, but there was something unmistakable about the tone. The voices sounded human, yet distant, like a conversation happening in another room, just out of reach. She sat up, straining to hear. Tom was still asleep beside her, his slow, steady breathing the only sound in the room. The whispers grew louder, and Emily's pulse quickened. They weren't just whispers now, they were distinct, faint words, garbled, but clear enough to send a chill down her spine. The words seemed to be calling her name, soft but insistent. Her breath caught in her throat. "Emily, come." Her heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded like her own, but not quite. She swallowed hard, the silence of the house amplifying every sound. She reached for the bedside lamp, but just as her fingers grazed the switch, the door creaked open slowly, almost imperceptibly. She froze. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the window. The door, once shut tight, was now ajar, just wide enough for a figure to slip through. Emily's heart pounded as she watched, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then, from the hallway, she saw it, a figure standing in the dark. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes. She wore an old, tattered dress, the fabric torn in places. Her hair hung in long, tangled strands, and her mouth moved soundlessly, as if speaking but unable to make a sound. The figure stepped closer, and Emily could feel the air grow colder, the oppressive presence thickening. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She shot out of bed, grabbing Tom by the arm and shaking him awake. "Tom, wake up," she whispered urgently, but Tom didn't stir. The figure reached the edge of the bed, its face now inches from hers, and in a voice as cold as ice, it whispered again. "You shouldn't have come." The end of the line. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she shook Tom harder, her panic rising. "Tom, wake up, please." But his body remained still, his face expressionless. She stared at him, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with terror. She could feel the weight of the figure in the doorway, its presence suffocating the air around her. Desperate, she scrambled to her feet and rushed to the window, her mind racing. She had to get out, now. She didn't care where she went, just away from the house, away from the presence that was closing in on her. She yanked at the window, but it wouldn't budge. Her hands were slick with sweat as she tried again, pulling with all her strength. But the window didn't open. It was as if it had been sealed shut, as though the house itself was stopping her from escaping. The cold, unnatural silence in the room was broken only by the low sound of the woman's whispering. Emily turned toward her, eyes wide with fear. The figure hadn't moved, but her eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, seemed to follow Emily, locked onto her with a predatory focus. "Why won't you leave?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step toward her, and the air grew colder still. Emily could feel the temperature drop sharply, like a tangible force pressing in on her. Her breath came out in visible puffs, but the woman, whoever she was, didn't seem to be affected by the chill. She looked at Tom again, still lifeless in the bed. Panic surged in her chest. What was happening to him? What had happened to him? Then, as if on cue, a low groan echoed through the house. The walls themselves seemed to shudder in response. Emily's skin crawled as the house began to change around her. The once familiar walls seemed to stretch, warp, and twist. The door to the room, once wide open, now appeared far down the hallway, unreachable, as if the house was deliberately pulling them further in. The ceiling above her felt lower, the air thicker. The whispering voices grew louder, demanding, urgent, "You shouldn't have come." In a frantic blur of motion, Emily turned and grabbed Tom by the shoulders, shaking him harder than before. His eyes remained closed. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, suffocating her. She couldn't stay. She couldn't stay here another second. Finally, she ran. Her legs felt heavy, her mind clouded with fear, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't stay. But as she reached the stairs and sprinted for the front door, she saw it. The door, once an escape, was now sealed shut, as if the house itself had locked her inside. Panic flooded her senses. She banged on the door, screaming for help, but there was no response. The house was not letting her go.